Ukrainian military intelligence has exposed the Russian economy. Just how is the Russian government trying to stabilize what is quickly becoming an economic crisis? And is Putin continuing to run a giant smokescreen, hiding the reality from the Russian public? Plus, we're going to talk about the provision of Patriot missile batteries to Ukraine, from the president saying that he wasn't going to sell Ukraine anything to suddenly forking over major missiles. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all of it. Okay. This is, I think, the most important story here, is that Ukrainian intelligence is actually saying that there seems to be growing signs of an economic crisis within Russia. Now, of course, there's a little bit of an incentive sometimes to push these kind of narratives because they can become self-fulfilling prophecies, right? Companies, when they make decisions, they look at the future and they decide how they want to prepare for it, right? Look at, for example, tech companies from maybe 18 months ago, where they looked at the future. They said, we think revenues are going to start to drop, so we are going to get lean. We're going to cut our costs, and that meant firing employees. But when you cut costs, reduce spending, and fire employees, you actually create the conditions of a recession-like environment. So it may be part of the Ukrainian intelligence services strategy to try to sort of reemphasize this. But remember, Russian media, the Russian media landscape isn't really subject to influence from a lot of external factors, both because of the commitment to the Russian language and, more importantly, the control the state exerts over its internet. So I think this actually should be on balance taken as being pretty credible. Now, there's the fundamental source of the problem, as the Ukrainians point out, but as we've pointed out on this channel, the fundamental source of the problem is that you cannot simply the government cannot grow an economy sustainably, right? Now, in the event of an acute crisis, for example, COVID, or even, COVID is actually a great example, right? Where there was a singular acute crisis, and then the government stepped in and said, listen, we are going to surge a lot of spending temporarily so that the economy can regain flight. Think about it. Imagine an airplane whose engines are all going out and there needs to be a reset. Government stimulus would act like a small rocket booster that pops the airplane up, giving the pilot time to turn those engines back on. The engines being the real economic growth of a country, real free market, a free market economy, right? And so sometimes that temporary government spending can keep a plane airborne, an economy airborne, preventing full collapse while those engines start to restart. But you cannot sustain that as a policy, right? There's a reason there's no rocket-powered planes. It's because that's a powerful but very inefficient and not long-term sustainable solution. That's kind of how this government stimulus war spending is functioning for the Russian economy. For 24 months, right, it seemed to be driving actually a pretty robust amount of growth. And we're going to take a look at those numbers and the forecast for the continued Russian growth and what the Russian State Duma is doing to try to put a stop to this. But first, I wanted to mention that if you're like me, you are busy. I have kids. I have a business. I have obviously a ton of content that I put out, and it's hard to work out. It's hard to, but what I've noticed is that 99% of guys say it's hard. I can't do it. I'm just not going to. And there's 1% of guys out there that say, even though it's hard, even though I'm busy, I'm going to find a way to get it done. They're the guys who wake up early before anyone else is awake and hit the gym. They're the guys who, instead of watching Netflix before bed, are out there hitting the weights, guys who are skipping their lunch break. And trust me, I'm one of them. I just ran, or rather did, a 50-mile triathlon, and I wasn't the fastest, but I got it done. And to train for it, I had to pull out all the stops. I had to work out over lunch break, morning, evenings, sitting on my garage in a stationary bike, whatever it took to get that training volume in. But I had a secret weapon, and that is Strike Gum, right? It's got an energy drink's worth of caffeine in every piece, right? With no sugar. So if you're interested in keeping your diet intact, but getting the boost of energy that you need where you need it, you want to go to strikegum.com or go to Amazon and just search Strike Gum, right? Don't waste your time driving to a gas station, buying a $5-6 energy drink, right? The cost of one piece of Strike Gum, which gets you an energy drink's worth of caffeine, is literally less than $1, especially if you get the 5-pack. You would be crazy to not get the 5-pack. In fact, we're updating our images because we're getting new 5-packs, which is going to be sick. But you want to subscribe and save. Oh, there you go. There's our 5-packs. You want to subscribe and save because look, if you know you're an energy drink guy and you need it every day or you need that extra boost, right? This is going to get you each energy drink's worth of caffeine is going to cost you less than $1. It's a no-brainer. So go to strikegum.com, go to Amazon, pick some up, join the 1% of guys that don't let I'm busy stop them. Link is in the description. Okay. So here's the thing with the Russians. You can't sustain this government spending for long. Why? Because government spending can only come from two places. It can come from your tax base, right? You can literally extract it from your citizens, which is fine. Every government collects some taxes. That's just how it works, right? But at some point, the tax burden becomes tremendously great, and the economic stimulus that is put out from taxation is never going to fully equal. It's never going to fully drive the growth the same way the free market would. And the fact is, especially when it's war spending, you have to think that every soldier that is killed in Ukraine, every Russian soldier killed in Ukraine, he could have been working, earning taxes, generating economic output, right? There is no economic output. There's no economic benefit to being a combat soldier, especially one with a short lifespan serving outside of your country, right? Remember, every Russian artillery shell, every Russian bullet that's manufactured is resources and personnel that could be spent on more economically productive activities, right? Every factory worker who's making Russian artillery shells, they should be making consumer goods, microwaves. They should be working in productive Russian industries, but they're not. And temporarily, right, as we've talked about, the Russian war machine has bumped salaries higher. It's improved employment, right? Like it or not, if you're serving in a meat wave assault unit in the Russian military, you are technically employed. And so it can juice the stats for a little while, but only for a time. And so what's happening is that now the Russian economy is realizing, damn, because we've started to crowd out, there's not enough private sector activity to sustain this war effort. And so the Russian Ministry of the Russian State Duma is increasing personal income taxes by 180%, by increasing corporate income taxes by 110%, and increasing the value add tax by 17%, right? 30% of Russia's small and medium-sized businesses already are on the verge of bankruptcy. This will likely drive up to 50% of Russian businesses out of business. So what you're seeing is exactly what we talked about already. Even without these tax increases, the average Russian business struggles to hire personnel. Remember, many of those people who are serving in Ukraine should instead be working at these small and medium businesses, right? And so they already have to pay more to attract the small pool of talent still available in the country. And now they have to pay even more on top of that, on top of this huge tax burden. And so every time one of these small and medium Russian businesses gets shutters, it's less tax revenue, it's less economic activity, and it's more taxes that have to be found somewhere else to fuel the Russian war machine. And what we're seeing, this is not a problem. This is a problem that happens on an exponential curve, right? And here, I'll show you this data from the World Bank, right? Pay attention, of course, to the Russian growth curve over the last several years. Let's see if we can zoom it in, right? So here's the Russian GDP real GDP growth, right? This is accounting for inflation. But remember, inflation is also a huge problem in the Russian economy, something like 20%. So you can see, of course, COVID bad. COVID sort of trashed the Russian economy. Then all economies had their big bounce back. Remember, the bounce back sometimes looks bigger as a percentage, but it's worth noting that, remember, if your economy collapses by 50%, it needs a 100% gain to come back, right? So it kind of, it shut down, it reopened, right? And then in 2022, you can see Russia invaded, sanctions hit, and then 2023, you saw the Russian economy actually have a bounce back, right? But then as government spending pushed, right? You can see literally where government consumption chewing a huge part of that growth. And again, it says private consumption and gross fixed investment. That's code for the war economy, right? Because you can see that what's happened is that since then, since this massive surge in spending, they're expecting every single year to see the Russian economy peter out. And this is exactly what we would expect to see in an economy slowly being consumed by its government spending, where, the government spending, wow, it looks great. And then slowly it gets worse, right? The ability, you cannot simply, right? As salty as I am about someone like Elon Musk, fundamentally, the government, you cannot create economic growth by just having everyone be a federal employee, right? It doesn't work. Governments have tried that and they've collapsed. And so you can see that without meaningful private sector growth, the Russian economy is going to be trying to squeeze more and more blood from a stone, really tanking growth rates to just less than 1%. But crucially, this is the real problem here, is that low growth rates can be a healthy part of the business cycle, right? Businesses are started and grow in a boom time, and then there needs to be a recession, a contraction, ideally a mild one, in which inefficient firms are forced out of the market and firms are forced to become more efficient, right? It's like you grow your plants and then you cut them back, you let the soil rest, and then the next season they grow back bigger and better than ever. But there's a problem. That is for a healthy economy with a healthy ratio of government spending to private economic activity. When you are the Russian government, this slowing economic growth is linked to a tremendous spike in inflation, right? The Russian government inflation rate says that things are great, but the actual inflation rate would be so much higher, because that's the thing. The idea is that in a recession environment, it sows the seeds of a future boom. Because look, imagine you have something like a bunch of Google firing a bunch of their tech people. Well, now those tech people need jobs. And suddenly, if you are a new up-and-coming firm, or you're an old firm that says, hey, we want to become more efficient with technology, now you can hire a Google engineer or a former Google engineer for a fraction of what they were paid before, right? But if you have an economy, so when you can hire new workers for less, that literally is the definition of low inflation, right? You get the same stuff for cheaper. But when you have very high inflation, as the Russian government is experiencing, as the ruble collapses and as government spending spikes, and you have a low economy, you can't expand your businesses. That's why it becomes this. This isn't a cyclical act. This is a permanent collapse of the Russian economy, or permanent for years to come. And this is a nightmare scenario for someone like Vladimir Putin, because for the same reason he has not instituted a large mass conscription, right? He could mobilize millions of Russian conscripts. He hasn't, because he realizes what happened when he did it the first time early in the war was that there was a massive brain drain, right? Every Russian with economic skills that could work outside the country fled the country. A lot of those Russians are still outside the country working elsewhere. And a lot of them, have actually filed for asylum claims. They've said, listen, I'm a dissident now. I fled the country. I would have been forced into military service. I've spoken out against it. I can't return. And so in their countries, a lot of times they are increasingly looking like they are permanently residing abroad. This is a huge problem for Vladimir Putin because not only does he need intelligentsia, he needs smart, skilled workers to grow his economy, right? War economy or conventional economy, but the Russian oligarchs, the Russian upper class also doesn't want to live in this collapsing economy, trapped in this box. Because remember, many Russian oligarchs, they're subject to sanction from the West. So when normally, right, when an economy collapses, the wealthiest tier of people just simply leave that and go somewhere else, right? But when they can't, when they're stuck in that world, that country, then they become irate at their failed government. In fact, it's actually one of the reasons that bad governments seem to persist is because instead of investing and trying to get right their country, the rich will often, especially in the developing world, the rich and powerful often simply say, oh, I'm going to relocate to Europe. I'm going to relocate to the United States. I'm going to relocate to our more stable neighbor. And that means that where there should be advocates to fix the government, there aren't. And the only people that remain are cronies of the government, right? Like Venezuela, for example. Basically, every Venezuelan with a college degree has pretty much fled the country and is working and living elsewhere, meaning that the only people left are, well, Maduro's cronies. And so this is sort of the problem that Vladimir Putin worries he's going to turn around and face, that he is going to see his oligarchs are going to be beating down the door, right? Saying, listen, you've collapsed our economy. You've caused us to be massively sanctioned. You have destroyed huge portions of the Russian state, right? And you've militarized the entire country and mobilized the world against us. We've participated in this scheme of yours, this war of yours for 3 years, and we are sick of it. And it is time for you to go, right? Because remember, Vladimir Putin, in a place like Russia, power is, Vladimir Putin doesn't exercise total power, right? He can't. Vladimir Putin doesn't personally order every soldier into battle. He doesn't personally instruct every cop in where to go. He doesn't personally guide every single industry, right? He relies on a cadre of lieutenants and oligarchs who do his bidding. But he knows that these lieutenants and oligarchs will turn on him. And ultimately, the dictator's nightmare is when your police, your army, your secret state security apparatus, and your chief largest industries all agree that it's time for you to leave. Because then who's left? Who are you going to arrest? Who are you going to use to arrest the upstart oligarchs? Who are you going to use to detain the chief of national police? Nobody. They're all against you. And so that is the fear that Vladimir Putin has in the event of an economic collapse. Now, to make things even worse, one of the things that has happened recently is, of course, Ukraine has signed its minerals deal with the United States. And while I have grave concerns about the U.S. Operating in this way, in this extractive way, where it says, hey, if you want us to help you, you got to sign this deal. You have to prepay for this aid, even if you are our ally and you are destroying America's enemies. I don't love it. And it's also kind of a weird turn because what is very bizarre is that the U.S. out of one side of its mouth says, hey, this minerals deal represents a sustained long-term partnership. We are operating as an ally of the Ukrainian government. And out of the other side of their mouth, they're saying, actually, we are a neutral broker looking to triangulate a peace deal between these two parties. When we don't have a side, we're neutral. This is This is not the fundamental reason that there hasn't been a peace deal. The fundamental reason there hasn't been a peace deal is because Vladimir Putin believes it is still worth it for him to pursue this war because he wants to dominate Ukraine. He wants to occupy probably the western 25% of the country or the eastern 25% of the country. And then he wants to control the government as a puppet state, much like he does with Belarus. That is the fundamental reason this war is persisting. But one of the failures of the U.S. administration is that it tries to do both of these things. But it seems like having signed the minerals deal, the U.S. is moving towards a stance where it says, hey, we're going to continue treating Russia as an enemy of the United States, which is funny because Russia this entire time has said we are an enemy of the United States, right? And in doing so is providing Ukraine with one of the pieces of military technology that it has needed worse than anything, which is Patriot missile batteries. What's interesting, though, is that the U.S. is actually sending a Patriot missile system currently based in Israel to Ukraine, right? This is, of course, to boost Ukrainian air defenses. And the DoD is going to continue to supply Ukraine with equipment from previously authorized packages, but didn't comment on the transfer from Israel, right? If two systems are undergoing public maintenance, possible repairs, if Israel and another country like Germany agrees, contribute one more, Ukraine's total could rise to 10, right? Now, it needs both the systems and the missiles themselves, but under U.S. export laws, even third-party transfers of Patriot missile require American approval. Two U.S. officials told the New York Times that the Israeli unit being prepared for Ukraine is an older version expected to arrive in the summer. But here's what's interesting, is that the Israelis may be coming to the same conclusion that we've talked about extensively here, which is that Russia is not operating in a vacuum, right? And we're seeing this is increasingly what we talked about, right? You have this network of authoritarian countries, and Iran is central to them, right? Iran has provided Shahed drones extensively to Russia. Remember, these are a key Russian strategic weapon. They are an entire dimension all their own of war. They are the strategic drone, and they have been besieging cities like Kiev and Lviv, Kramatorsk. They can really hit almost anywhere in the country. And Iran has been very increasingly active. There's also a lot of rumors that Russian air defense systems have been deployed in Iran to help counter the Israeli Air Force. And more troubling is that many of the weapons that the Houthis are using to shoot down U.S. drones are also provided by Russia. And so the absurdity, it looks increasingly absurd for the United States to have a conciliatory stance towards Russia while having an aggressive stance towards Iran, right? It's like saying, oh, I can't stand my neighbor's house, but I like their living room. It doesn't make any sense. You're like, the living room's part of the house. You can't say these things, right? You cannot, it's like trying to stop a leak, but only on one side of the pipe, right? You have to stop the leak around the entire thing. It doesn't work, right? And so this idea is something that maybe I think even the Israelis are starting to realize. They say, listen, the more we damage Russia, the harder a time the Houthis are going to have. And they say victory for the West to win, or if you're Israel, you say the only way to truly stop an Iranian victory is to terminate this entire autocratic alliance. That China has to be contained, Iran has to be contained, Russia has to be contained. All of these allies need to collectively be crushed. And not even crushed and defeated, simply contained, simply boxed into their countries, right? And this is and so I am somewhat optimistic that the Israelis are saying, listen, the Ukrainians have shown they're willing to help out, right? They were willing to oust the Assad regime and replace it by providing FPV drones, damaging Russian allies. The Israelis said, great, we are into this. Again, this whole sort of nothing is in isolation. And I think more and more of some Western countries are kind of beginning to understand this, right? That they have to fight this network of enemies collectively together with unity of purpose. So I'm hoping and mildly optimistic that this is a sign that this is the trend of things to come. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmerling, Brian Kelly, Dale McCombs, James Zola, Henry Roussier, all of our Lieutenant Tier members over on combatvetnews.com. And I will catch you guys in the next one. Hit that subscribe button. Cheers.